My name is Rainer Silbereisen. Unfortunately, I was not able to attend the workshop due to an unhappy accident. I broke my foot, and doctors told me that this is the king's class of broken foots. All 3 ankles were broken. It was apples on a wet meadow in the night. It was a steep downward hill. I carried some stuff, and then my foot got stuck, and I should not tell you how it looked like then. When this had happened, I was wondering who could substitute for me. And of course, Professor Tom Cook was the absolute first choice because he is tremendously good in methodology, and methodology is an important issue. And I was very sure that he understands what I wanted to tell, and as far as I learned, this was perfectly done.
So the talk is about disasters, the core topics and concepts of psychological research, application. Rainer wrote this to have an introduction, to talk about natural hazards and disasters, and then about some of the concepts, exposure, vulnerability. Then he wants to talk about the role of science in reactions, psychological reactions to disaster. And then he wanted to talk about various hotspots, he calls them, of relevant psychological research. These are the things he thinks are the most important parts for dealing with disasters. Then he wants to talk about lessons for science training and communication. And then at the end will be a brief outline of workshop activities. As you know, this workshop is a further step in a series of similar workshops dealing with psychological research and practices concerning disasters, and how people and communities deal with these disasters, and how these factors affect individual biopsychosocial well-being. And it's organized, this workshop, by the International Union of Psychological Sciences and its partners. This union represents over 1 million psychologists worldwide, 1 million, and it's organized into 90 countries and 20 affiliated organizations. There is more information you can get about past workshops, programs, and results at the address below. The guiding principle has always been to bring up-to-date basic and applied science that's relevant to young investigators and academically trained practitioners who are located in regions prone to natural disasters, such as this Asia-Pacific region. Mostly in the United States, we have political disasters. The target group is mostly people affiliated with and trained in psychology as a discipline. And the International Faculty Workshop has always represented, and I hope always will represent, a mixture of various academic disciplines, but mainly psychology, and who deal mostly directly with the topic of disaster, but sometimes indirectly. And they're all supposed to be renowned experts in their field. We're also, I hope, very skeptical about renowned experts. We aim at a combination of basic, applied, and translational research. Translation research results into practice, to action. And we'll range in this talk from new insights into epigenetic effects of disasters. That would be how the co-relationship of genes and events in the world outside of our bodies interact to determine behavior and feelings. So we'll talk about epigenetic effects as pathways in the emergence of disaster consequences for human behavior and development. We'll also talk about Rainer will talk about cutting-edge research in relevant contexts, such as families and communities. Notice here we have individual genetics, things happening outside of individuals, all in the context of families and communities, all leading to manifestations of strain, such as bereavement and post-traumatic stress disorder, and finally to various means of evidence-based interventions. So there's almost nothing that is not included in this talk. A prime emphasis always has been on the cultural awareness needed when generalizing scientific approaches. Right? so as not to be culturally limited to the countries that are producing most of the research. And there's been an emphasis on the roots of individual and collective differences in response to disasters, such as personality and resilience, and on the long-term consequences of disasters for which longitudinal research is used. And finally, the focus has always been on methodological rigor in planning interventions as a common denominator of all sciences. So you can see that this agenda is extremely broad, the psychological agenda, extremely broad. And one of your topics as an individual human being and scientist will be to decide where in this huge space you want to do your work. But this is the talk is about the context for work that you would do within this large space that is described today. Now let's talk about some definitions. We're going to talk a little bit about natural hazards. These are potentially damaging physical events and phenomena which may cost lives or lead to injuries, property damage, social and economic disruption in individual lives or communities, or the degradation of physical environments. So these are the hazards we have to contend with. Disasters are when serious disruptions occur to the functioning of a community or science society, causing widespread human, material, economic, or environmental loss. This is a major sphere of intellectual discourse during the next 4 days. Risk processes disasters result from a process comprised of a combination of hazards, conditions of vulnerability, we're going to talk more about vulnerability later, and insufficient capacity for measures to reduce the potential negative consequences of risk. So the risk process says that there are combinations of hazards. Some people and some cultures and some societies are more vulnerable to these same hazards than others. And in part, this may be because of insufficient capacity for measures to reduce the potential negative consequences through building codes, through the training of professionals to deal with disasters, through the money you have available to deal with disasters. And over the next 4 days, we're going to talk about 4 types of risk. Thank you. We're going to talk about geophysical events. We're going to like volcanoes, earthquakes. We're going to talk about meteorological events related to, of course, climate. Hydrological events related to the amazing power of water. And we're going to talk about climatological events. I'm glad we're going to talk about climatological events because in the United States, Congress has stopped us talking about climate. Not that they've stopped the scientists, but they're trying to stop all discussion of it. My wife works for the National Science Foundation in Washington, D.C., and Congress recently passed limitations to the National Science Foundation budget. They tried to cut out all research on behavioral, social, and economic research, and they tried to cut out all research on climate change. What can I say? Anyway, we're going to talk about these 4 types of risks: geophysical events, meteorological events, hydrological events, and climatological ones. And these can be found across the globe. Now this is a map put out by the insurance industry, Munich Re, and it locates loss events throughout the world in the year 2014. And we can see that our region of the world here is associated with events of different kinds. Typhoons are in this green color, floods are in this blue light color, Winter damage is in this gold color, and there's another color somewhere. But you can see there is a lot of concentration in our part of the world. The size of the dot indicates the seriousness of the event, and you can see that this has many of the biggest dots in it. There's a lot of smaller events around in Europe, so some of this may be recording bias. And as you can see, there's another stretch along the Andes Mountains and in North America. But the biggest events are clearly in this part of Asia. This is loss events during this year we're in right now for the first 6 months. And you can see that, again, the big events are along the Himalayan chain. They are, again, here in Southeast Asia, and with a lot in Eastern Australia. Now, the number of disasters overall have steadily increased over the last several decades, especially hydrometeorological and climatological disasters. I can't even speak my native language anymore. Especially hydrometeorological and climatological disasters. That's 3 of the types of disasters he talked about. But they've now become 2 magically. And these 2 disasters, because he's combining hydrological and meteorological now, amount to 80% of the total, affecting 90% of the population hit by disasters, and count for half the death toll. So the other half of the death toll is accounted for by the missing one, and the missing one is geophysical events. Here is a time series of loss events worthwhile, again put out by the insurance industry. And you can see that, and there's a upward trend, so that more natural hazards and disasters have been occurring. And I have no idea to what extent this is a result of better recording of hazards and disasters, but it certainly looks like there could well be an upward trend in these kinds of events. This is color-coded, as you can see, by type of events, with the red being the geophysical events, which have stayed pretty constant over time. So the red at the bottom is pretty flat. The next is meteorological events in green, and you can see that they have increased in reported frequency over time. The 4th one is hydrological events, and you can see that they have been increasing over time. And the 4th is climatological events, and that has not been increasing very much over time, but has been increasing somewhat. You can see that to the extent there is a reporting bias here, you can see that the meteorological events and the hydrological events have been the ones that have been increasing. So it's weather and water that seems to be on the increase, as opposed to climate change and geophysical events. Maybe the Republicans in America really do know that climate change doesn't count. Anyway, Asia Pacific is a special case. It's the region with more losses compared to other regions of the world. In 2013, 19 of 22 million people displaced by floods, earthquakes, and typhoons lived in your part of the world. That's amazing. 19 of the 22 million killed live here, this part of the world. Out of the 10 worst disasters during the 21st century, 7 happened in Asia Pacific. Globally, it's postulated that the increasing extreme events will hit Asia Pacific hard due to its rapid population growth and urbanization. 6 of the 10 largest cities in the world are located here, and building codes. Even if the engineers are great, even if the architects are great, some of the builders are less great. and the urban places are prone. The urban population in Asia Pacific in 2020 will be 55% of the people living here will be in large cities, compared to 17% in 1950. So all of this is about the vulnerability of this region. This is a plot of the presumed likelihood of risks to occur within the next 10 years. 7 means it's highly likely. And you can see here that the likelihood things are going to happen and the size of the impact are plotted against each other. And so this top quadrant here indicates the things that are most likely to happen with the largest consequences. And you can see up here are things like winter storms, cyber attacks, unemployment or underemployment, and the biggest one is interstate conflict. Right? So this is not just natural disasters, these are political, cultural, national state issues. But these are the things that are going to happen, that's presumed to happen, and of these, the worst one is going to be weather and water up in the red. Any of the other kinds of disasters that interest us that Rainer has put on here, I can't see. Maybe the crocodile also knows it's cleaning its teeth or something. Good symbiotic relationship, but I'm glad I'm not that bird. So we're going to talk about hazard, risk, exposure, vulnerability, and resilience, which are key concepts here. We've talked about hazards already. Exposure has to do with the location of people, assets, infrastructure in hazard-prone areas. So we've just given the data why Southeast Asia is very exposed to potential natural disasters. The vulnerability, which is the degree of susceptibility or sensitivity of people, assets, and infrastructure to suffer damage. So you're more vulnerable if the physical world in which you live is not very well constructed to deal with natural disasters. Exposure is a key determinant of disaster risk, and vulnerability is the key driver of disaster loss. It's important to note those two concepts: disaster risk, so exposure makes you vulnerable to risk, and vulnerability drives how much you lose because of that risk. Both show temporal and spatial variability around the world and even within Asia, plus differentiation by race, ethnicity, social class, gender, age, etc. So not everybody is equally vulnerable in any one country. It's driven a lot by race, ethnicity, social class. Exposure is exponentially increasing, he maintains, due to population growth and an increase in economic assets. So with each new disaster, more will be lost due to population growth and the growing material welfare of more nations. Resilience is very important to psychologists, as we are. It's the capacity to overcome adversities and dire circumstances. It's rooted, Rainer maintains, in a particular interaction between person and environment. It's not a person attribute. That's very important to psychologists. Resilience is not something like gender, which is an attribute of you and is fixed. Resilience is an interaction between your attributes and the world. Right? So it is located in the space between people and worlds. It's not just an individual difference attribute. Often people's resilience is underrated. Populations who've lived for generations in disaster-stricken regions have developed more resilience than expected. This is a lot of research being done in Bangladesh and the Bengalis, who are always prone to very, very serious flooding, which shows that they have partially adapted to dealing with these disasters. Partially adapted, partially. So this is a case of individual development and cultural change going hand in hand. Resilience seems to be promoted, but in people who have close relationships and strong attachments to individuals and families, people who know how to learn and think for themselves, people who are capable of self-regulation, which is a very important psychological construct that's now being studied a lot, at least in the United States and Western Europe. Self-regulation is the ability to control your own feelings, your own cognitive reaction to things, to be able to live in a measured way. Mastery motivation and spirituality. People who are spiritual tend to have greater resilience to things than people who are more secular. This I don't quite understand, friends, so you might have to help me here. This is a relationship between exposure and vulnerability. This is from a study by Norris et al. In 2009, and it gives data at 3 time points: before a disaster, immediately after a disaster, at a delay interval time 2, and at a delay interval time 3. And I have no idea whatsoever what the numbers are on the y-axis, but they go from lower to higher. The resistance, one says resistance did not change over these 4 time points, before and after disaster. The next one down shows resilience, and shows resilience going up immediately after the disaster, and then coming down. Comes down to the same level as before. It doesn't sink lower, so there's no evidence of resilience being undermined. It just reverts back to its prior level. The recovery process indicates that there's an immediate intervention to help with the physical recovery, and so you get that sharp increase immediately, and then recovery efforts understandably diminish back to close to the old level. Relapsing and remitting, I would guess, and I'm only guessing here, somebody can help me out if they have more technical knowledge than I have. You should feel free to interrupt me. My guess is that remitting and relapsing is individual reactions to the disaster, and this cubic function indicates people relapsing initially, then getting better, and then relapsing again. And if so, it doesn't really hang in well with the curve for resilience, because the resilience went up. And if the resilience went up immediately, how can the relapsing go up? But anyway, who am I? Delayed dysfunction, by definition, is delayed. As you can see here, it's delayed. It increases with time. And chronic dysfunctionality goes up. And it's chronic because it's a reaction to the event that took place, the disaster, and then levels off without going down again, which is very surprising. So I'm not quite sure what all that means. Forgive me, I'm not Reiner. I'm me. So, and I'm a methodologist, and I do work on time series. So.
If you could just get that slide back on here. It's something I'm sure we'll talk about a lot over the next few days. When you're thinking about exposure, it's really important to think about exposure to what. So disasters aren't often single impacts. Often there may be an impact that stretches out over a period of time, but is also the primary stressor of the hazard that has become a disaster, but also you're looking at the secondary stresses as well. What is the adaptation that is required to cope with the disaster, and does that bring its own consequences too? So that might help to explain that relapsing, remitting, even though resilience increases, you're actually having to ask about resilience to what is the forced adaptation that's required later on in the piece, which is why obviously longitudinal studies are required.
Thank you, sir. You should all feel free to interrupt, right, at all times. So we've just described the big picture on disasters, the key concepts, and the like. And now Ryan wants to move to talk about the role of psychological science in dealing with disasters. He believes that science and its translation are crucial to the assessment of disaster risk, and he quotes a study that deals with the comparison of two earthquakes. There was an earthquake that registered at 7 on the Richter scale, I guess, in Port-au-Prince in Haiti, and 1 out of every 10 Haitians died. There was an earthquake measuring 8.8 on the Richter scale in Concepcion in Chile, and only 1 out of every 2,500 Chileans died in the same year. The point here being, of course, that the Chilean earthquake was larger, significantly larger, and the death rates were quite different because the Chileans had known about the exposure to earthquakes and had spent more money and time and knowledge improving the infrastructure around people. So the people of Haiti were not even aware of the seismic risks and have no appropriate building code, whereas in Chile they did. Right? Beyond the tremendous investments due to economic power and measures for reduction of poverty, there are no-cost or low-cost interventions possible, Ryan maintains, such as collaboration between regional sciences and community alliances in order to pass on the knowledge that the Chileans had that the Haitians did not have. So he believes that relevant and productive science needs to be evidence-based and addressing the causes of losses of physical lives and psychological well-being caused by disasters. There is actually a theory-based compendium list of effective practices dealing with disasters, which are on an American website called the Campbell Collaboration. Some of you here in public health and medicine may know the similar one in that field called the Cochrane Collaboration. This lists the studies that have been done on any one of many topics in order to show what works to reduce the risks. So Ryan is telling us here that the website, the Campbell Collaboration, has on it priorities for information needed following natural disasters and other humanitarian emergencies. So that's a website you should really look at, because I've studied many websites like this, and I know of no others that deal with natural disasters. Maybe the Cochrane Collaboration would do from a health perspective, but the Cochrane Collaboration does from a social, behavioral, and economic perspective. The role of psychological science in Rainer is to find out what works to lessen the consequences of disasters, and he implies that the main tool that psychologists use for this is the randomized clinical trial. We'll be talking about this in my talk on the last day, since I am a mere methodologist. And as you probably know, the randomized clinical trial takes a population of people, which is here on the left, takes a population of people and then assigns them randomly by a lottery, by chance, into two groups. One group gets the intervention that's trying to mitigate the consequences of a disaster, and the control group does not. And then you follow them up, and you compare the results for these two groups. These two groups are identical in expectation, similar to each other to start with within the limits of sampling error, and so if they differ afterwards, it cannot be because they differ to start with, because the random assignment made them equal. And so this is the classical design, embedded in the 1920s by Fisher, used all the time in agriculture, in medicine, in now increasingly in education, in order to study the effectiveness of attempts to deal with disasters. And we're going to talk about other alternatives too, but this is the main tool, and psychologists learn it in their very first statistics class, and it's a bit like mother's milk. It's not like mother's milk to economists, though a few labor economists are getting there. So the role of psychological science is to deal with disasters in a psychological framework, and this needs a heuristic approach that appreciates the interrelatedness of environmental risks and economic, social, and cultural systems within which we all develop. Psychological research and practice plays a part in the 4 R's. We have 2 people who've worked in New Zealand here. I know nothing about this. All I know is some of the best postdocs I've ever had have come from New Zealand. So they have really good training as undergraduates at least. These 4 R's in New Zealand are dealing with the reduction, examining sources of risks, and especially how to implement mitigation measures, readiness, planning and readiness of what to do, response, mobilization of necessary emergency measures, and recovery, restoring of functions. So Reiner is saying that these are 4 of the areas in which psychologists can make a difference. And he's inviting you to think which of those 4 areas are the ones in which you want to make a difference. All the above can profit from psychology, but it must be guided by cultural awareness about the constraints of existing psychological models. The international response to the 2004 Indian tsunami was an example of misleading presumptions based on Western models and thinking. Apparently, I don't know this case at all, where the assumption was that the Westerners presumed that post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and suicide would occur at academic proportions, but local experts thought otherwise because of this adaptation over the years to tsunamis or to events, and the latter were proven right and the Western psychologists wrong. Again. So it brought here to this Indian case Western-derived interventions that were inadequate for local ways of social interaction and norms concerning privacy, dignity, emotional display, and family solidarity. The presumption is that our best friends are people who not only know the literature on psychological reactions to disaster, but people who also know the local culture. Because these Western models in the Indian context undermine privacy, dignity, emotional display, and family solidarity. So psychology as a discipline needs to internationalize, even though you probably realize reading psychology textbooks that it sort of claims to be universal. And this means that psychology has to reach out to other academic disciplines to know the context in which change events are located. Now here is what Reiner believes are the hotspots of relevant psychological research. He's going to present 2 new research lines that are likely to change the field of psychological research on disasters. So he's trying to give you his sense of where the cutting edges for the future, and young people should be hungry to know these cutting edges for the future. And it addresses the ways in which biological and the ecological background of human behavior and development relate to psychology and disasters. The biological and the ecological, they're the 2 things he's going to stress. Both topics have been addressed in prior workshops to various degrees, but they've never been the focal point. And he wants to introduce them here because I guess Reiner wants them to be the focal point. I've gone backwards. So, his opening postulate is that human behavior and development is a dynamic system working on different time scales and comprising various biodirectional layers of functioning with influences from the genetic to the environmental bottom up, and in the reverse top down. It's a model by Gottlieb. And this says everything's related to everything else. So it says that the causally related to everything else. It says the environment, human behavior, human neural activity in the mind, in the brain, and genetic activity are all interdependent and change with each other over time. So this is a very huge space, right? Genetics, brain sciences, behavioral sciences, and sciences of the environment, right? They're all interdependent causally. Now, no human being can hope to understand the environmental sciences, the behavioral sciences, the brain sciences, and the genetic sciences. So what he's presenting here is the background within which your own research, which will be more modest and doable, has to be fitted intellectually. So this is about background. So he thinks that disasters represent a complex environmental influence inducing collective and individual responses by physical changes that disrupt connections between people, between countries and communications, by dislocations that disrupt communities and families, and by direct and indirect effects on biopsychosocial adjustments of individuals and groups. Bio, psycho, social, that's a lot. As illustrated by the Gottlieb model. He maintains that the causal pathways linking environments to behavior are better understood now than they were thanks to new approaches in genetics. Epigenetics, as we said before, is a new strand of research on gene-environment interdependence. About 80% of our genes are only switched on in response to environmental effects, influences. Only 20% of our genes are self-expressing. So he's interested in the modulation of gene expression at the molecular level and how environmental stresses affect the genes that are switched on and switched off. This is achieved through biological changes such as DNA methylation that alters the readability of DNA segments relevant for the regulation of protein and enzyme products. So he's now inviting you to get into genetics. So he's maintaining that adversities due to disasters will disrupt family relationships, decrease the quality of parenting, and alter the expression of genes involved in cortisol regulation in the brain and body. Cortisol regulation is highly related to stress, right? So there's a well-known link between stress, cortisol, and gene expressions and behavior. And it's involved in depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. So this link between stress, post-traumatic stress disorder, and depression is the most well-researched psychological consequences of disasters. And he's saying we should extend that research agenda also to look at the genetic part of it. Here is a fancy picture that I'm going to go over because I don't understand it. So this is more on epigenetics because it's been shown that methylation, which controls whether the gene expresses itself or not, can be revoked by lifestyle factors and psychological interventions. And social genomics, which is a growing field, is about the possibility of collective coordination of genome activity because individual regulation can be influenced by the experiences we have with other people in a group. So groups are not just about joy and happiness and sadness and despair. Groups are also about how your body reacts to all these wonderful and sometimes horrifying things due to our group life. This is more of the same. So here's his sense of the hotspots. We've talked about the human mind behavior here a little bit. He's talked earlier about culture, how each nation has to interpret the research produced for its own context. And now he wants us to talk about social ecology. There's a few examples of it. Research demonstrates that the historical prevalence of pathogens in the environment influence the modal personality. People living in certain areas are more collectivist, more family-oriented, less extrovert, more religious, and in general more in-group oriented than are others. And this is associated with a genetic variant on a particular gene, which is more prevalent in collectivist cultures. Most of this research has been done in China on the difference between wheat-producing and rice-producing regions in North versus South China, because rice cultivation corresponds to a prominence of interdependent cells and heuristic thinking, whereas wheat cultures, is the case here, is associated with a sense of independent selves and analytic thinking, leading to this division, where the claim is that's been demonstrated in China, in a famous article in Science, that the rice culture is more collectivist, family-oriented, less extrovert, more religious, and in-group oriented than is the wheat culture of northern and especially northeastern China. There are also other things that speak to the differences between those regions, not the least of which is history, not the least of which is climate, not the least of which is other things. But the claim here is that the social economic structure co-determines psychology. Processes that play a role in the translation of culture and ecology into individual behavior have been talked about by Gelfand. He compared 33 nations meant to represent cultural differences in tightness, which means having many strong norms and a low tolerance for deviant behavior, versus looseness, which has weak social norms and a high tolerance for deviant behavior. And you get this even in families. And he thinks that this cultural complex, these national differences in tightness versus looseness, is rooted in historical ecological threats. Prominent among them is disasters. So that tightness and looseness have developed in responses to disasters. I'm not quite sure what the mechanisms are. Both are promoted in the current days by recurrent episodes in daily life, as in the structure and constraints reflect this strong versus weak cultural orientation. And all these things are interacting and changing with time, so that the social ecologies are changing all the time. The genes are changing in response to the social ecology. The changes in the genes are feeding back to affect the social ecology, and everything is very, very complicated. I'm racing a bit now in time. So social change affects the opportunity to study the intricate relationship between culture and social ecology. The famous example here is research comparing young people who lived in successor states to the former Soviet Union, like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and the like. It found that after the Soviet collectivist model was removed, these cultures reverted back closer to their origins before the Soviet Union. So even though there had been 60 years, 3 generations of living with a Soviet model, as soon as the model was removed, Tajiks reverted back to be more like Tajiks, Uzbeks to Uzbekis, and the like, so that the culture here persisted despite the change in the social ecology induced by the Soviet collectivist monocultural aspiration. So here's the bottom line of what Ryan is saying, is the foreseeable future of research on psychological reactions to disaster will combine epigenetics and social ecology in new ways. This is over and above the current agenda, which is about stress, resilience, coping, and post-traumatic stress disorder and depression, right? So this is over and above the current agenda. He thinks that there's a notion of, with Belsky, of differential susceptibility. Some people are generally more affected by the social ecology than others, and this applies in good or bad environments alike, so in promotive environments or bad environments. Some people are more susceptible to environments than others, and he claims that there's neurobiological processes that indicate this, and it's obviously very important to know this because some people are more affected than others, and you'd like to know which persons are more affected than others. So that's his hope for the next years of disaster research by psychologists, that they'll move into epigenetics at the low individual level and into social ecology at the high macro level, while retaining the agenda in between on stress, post-traumatic stress disorder, and depression. So he's also very concerned, time is going by, I'll be quick, that research insights have to be translated into practical action that policymakers and others can use, and that in the past, this issue of translational research on how to get information used has often failed. He claims that partly because researchers don't know much about what it takes to translate research findings into policy action, because practitioners are motivated, don't know much about the standards by which the quality of research should be judged. And they don't know much about the methods, therefore, so they need to increase their readiness for intervention and establish teams and networks that can help them understand what the research means. Policymakers have difficulties taking up research results due to little familiarity, like practitioners. They require, for evidence, they require more and more evaluation results, cost-benefit analysis, and they need to know more about whether the public will accept these reactions to disasters, because they need to get re-elected. So acceptance of the general public is non-trivial to politicians. Just as cost-benefit analysis purports to give them the bottom line that for every dollar put in, there'll be $2 coming out. Notice my skepticism purports to. So these three groups have to work more together in order to learn how to interpret evidence for policy. And he thinks that more research should be mission-driven, so applied research, rather than basic research, which is curiosity-driven. He believes there's already excellent knowledge in many parts of psychology about relevant theory, methods, empirical insights, and the limitations of this knowledge. And he wants researchers to be even more aware that policy is under the influence of time pressures, under the influence of pressure groups. We have a particular habits of doing things, and they have a particular habit of doing things in the policy world, and they are watched by the media at all times, at least in Western Europe and the United States, and so that policy needs coverage, needs good coverage. So he wants us to remember and never to forget that politics drive human functioning, dignity, and the quality of life. This is especially true in societies and situations with extreme power imbalances between the rich and the poor, between ethnicities and the like, that politics is a driving force. If you don't influence politics with research, then your research isn't worth very much, is the bottom line that Ryan was saying. Now I'm supposed to outline for you, that's the end of the substance of his talk, which I consider to be an invitation to you to decide where in all of this space you want to do your research. Do you want to be more basic, more applied? Do you want to deal with the past agenda? Do you want to try and go into social ecology? Do you want to try and go into epigenetics and the like? There'll be presentations by faculty, like this one you just heard. Today we'll have questions, maybe we won't. A few maybe. I'm looking to the boss here. And the boss says maybe a few. Usually we'll have a plenum discussion afterwards. Today is the only exception to that. This morning is the only exception to that. We'll break out into groups, and that will be another activity, so you can talk about among yourselves about what is happening. I hope you won't, by the way, stick with people from your own nationality who speak your own language. That's not the point of a meeting like this. So seek out the uncomfortable, because it's probably going to be the most rewarding. And we're going to have poster discussions. I've seen a lot of posters being carried valiantly on the backs of people, and I hope they're just made out of paper and not out of lead, because they look pretty big. And so we will have poster discussions too. And here is a picture of the famous Rainer, who is not quite as good looking as I. No. That's it. Lots of references. So we have a few minutes for questions. And I have the right to say I don't know, and I have the right to ask the audience, would you like to comment on other people's questions? So do we have any questions? Yeah. Can you identify yourself first, name?
Hello, this is Aziz from India. My question is related to epigenetics. So it's how epigenetics will be helpful for the disaster management?
I think epigenetics is going to be very important for those of you who are committed to very basic research on disasters and reactions to them. I suspect for most of you, epigenetics will have little importance at all, because it requires collaboration with biologists, it requires knowing a lot about genetics, it requires having access to very, very expensive and difficult equipment in order to be able to locate alleles on genes. It requires then a lot of research to relate, to do studies of the statistical interaction between alleles and environmental effects. Most good causal explanation epigenetics is going to talk not about one allele and one gene, but most things are polygenetic. That means many genes are simultaneously involved. And the research now is just looking at single alleles and single genes. So I suspect the relevance to you here is close to zero. But you should be able to read the literature and have a loose understanding of it, because there will be more studies of this kind, because it is what we Americans call the flavor of the month. It is very important, at least in the United States. And my wife was recently meetings at the White House on the president's launching this new brain initiative and this huge new genome initiative. And the two will go together, but it will be 10, 20, 30 years before it's practical knowledge. So remember, I'm giving you what Ryan said.
Yeah, I'm not asking about the practicalities of your conducting this kind of research. I mean, how it is going to help to reduce, say, intensity or maybe mitigate the problems of those people who are middle of the disaster or after that?
In many years from now, it might help identify those persons who are going to have the strongest reactions to environmental disasters because of their gene susceptibility, and something could be done in the distant future to relocate those people, to help them understand what is happening, so that people delivering psychological services would go to those people first because their risk level is higher. But that is not possible today. But my guess is that will be 40 or 50 years from now how it will be used.
If I could just contribute to that as well.
Yeah.
So I'm a big believer in public mental health. Okay, and I think this is about a case of levels of analysis. So you can look at the level of epigenetics and look at the allele gene structure change and look at the interventions that may help to promote that. It would be very expensive, very far down the line, if we were looking at targeting those types of interventions for those people who we've identified may benefit specifically. An alternative approach you can take is if we know that we have interventions that make a difference in terms of things like self-regulation and helping people to adapt, those personal attributes, those interpersonal indicators that we know are indicative of resilience. If we can use the work that's being done on epigenetics as a levels of analysis, we know that we can put in public mental health interventions that have a broad impact upon the community, and we can hope that they will also have an impact upon those people who are particularly vulnerable, and we can follow those people over time. I don't think we need to wait until the science is at a point where we understand the translation of epigenetics in terms of behaviour at a great level for us to start making good public mental health interventions. So I think that you need to consider perhaps yourself as your position as translational researchers. You read the research, you're familiar with the research, and you apply that to the interventions that are currently available or will be available in the next 2 or 3 years, and you understand the implications at all levels. Does that make sense?
Okay, we can talk it later, but like say, because others may be interested to ask different questions, but still I am not very clear about like what exactly you are proposing, that if somebody has undergone some disaster, there is a genetic change. That is what you are proposing?
Yeah, but epigenetics says it also works the other way around.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
Everything's related to everything else.
Yeah.
So you can put an intervention for those people who have had some kind of change after a disaster that reverses that turns the methylation on and off.
Yeah, excuse me, this also answers, this epigenetic issue also answers, like in some disaster, 10% of the people are having post-traumatic stress disorder. In some disaster, maybe 30% people are having post-traumatic stress disorder. That is being like, what is the percentage of the people who are going to be going to develop post-traumatic stress disorder or high trauma reaction? That is also determined to some extent by these epigenetic factors. So why some people are at higher risk to develop PTSD, why some people are at lower risk to develop PTSD, that is answered by the epigenetic research also. That is also the part of the current trend of research nowadays.
That is the aspiration of this research, but it presumes that in the public mental health, from sort of a public health perspective, we have a census of all the people standing on these relevant alleles. That would allow us to know in advance who are susceptible. We do not have this. We're not going to produce it in the next few years. It's a hope, and it's an aspiration. But my guess would be it's not something for tomorrow. So, that was a great question. Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? Can you identify yourself?
Thank you. My name is Lisa from Indonesia. There's a saying in Indonesia that one disaster leads to another disaster, so the disaster is multiplying. And talking about the material today, that we should see even from the gene level to the very macro level, political level. There's a huge area that we can do research in terms of research. But in terms of applying the result of the research, it's kind of hard if we try to look all of these aspects, the multiple aspects. So should we just see one topic and like close our eyes to other, or should we see the implication of our research topic to other layer of level in terms of application of the research result? Thank you.
That's a very, very good question. I think what Rainer was trying to say is that these levels, from the most microbiological to the most macro social ecological, are all causally interdependent with influences going in each direction. No human being can understand all of that, right? So our choice as individuals is to decide where within that space we do our own research, but we know about the context provided by that space. In most of science, the hardest question is, what's the question worth asking? It's not how do I answer that question. It's what question is worth asking. And each of you will have different interests. Some will be more micro, some will be more macro, some will want to try and connect different levels. That's your choice. It's a very, very difficult choice that should not be rushed into, though it can't be delayed forever, otherwise you'll never get any research done. And I think Rainer was trying to say, it's not research if you haven't done it. You cannot do all of this space he described. How do you choose where to do it? And I think there's another aspect to this, because research is very, 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 very serious. But it should be fun. If it's not fun, it's not worth doing. And it's very, very, very serious. Fun is often with other people. It's not like being a lone monk or a nun. Right? Life is with people. Right? So it's more fun to do research together with people you trust and like. Right? One of the great potential benefits of being at a congress like this is you can meet other people with whom you might want to interact in the future on a shared interest within Rainer's space. That would be my hope. That would make for a successful congress. Inshallah. So, anybody else want to answer that question? So, last question here. Okay. Last question.
I'm Dr. De Leon from Adventist University of the Philippines. I'd like to say thank you for the wonderful presentation. I'm more focused on how I can apply my research. So it's not really a question, but just really a commendation on your part. It's a reminder for all of us that research should not bring us to rest in peace or RIP, but rather we should be challenged and have hope that it should help us to be RIP, where we can call it research in practice. Thank you once again.
Thank you, that's well said. That's a great command and knowledge of the English language to say that. And that's Rainer's hope too, which is why he added this piece on the end about translational research and research into practice, and why he reminded us that research is embedded within politics and action. Great, well thank you all for your kind attention.